I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this conversation with Volker Turk, who is the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection. And I was told that you were recently in Syria, so we will probably ask you quite a few questions about what you saw and heard in Syria. When Filippo Grandi was here and he visited Syria, he made a very cautious statement. But in Lebanon, we're not very used to deal cautiously with cautious statements. So it was misinterpreted in a variety of ways. This is not an invitation to you to be very cautious. I think this audience is made up of people who have come to discuss, to learn, and I think a number of them are engaged in either in service to community of Syrian refugees, or in advocacy, or research. Now, we're a research institute more centered on policy issues, and there is always a fine line between doing policy research and becoming sort of advocates of what you think is a good cause. So sometimes we cross the border and act as advocates for what we think is a good cause. Now, the Global Compact that you will be talking about has sort of extended an invitation to academic institutions to take part in the global discussion over refugees and their future, and their rights, and we didn't wait for that compact to develop, I would say, intimate relations with UNHCR in Lebanon, and we're pleased to be in a whatever modest way helpful in getting UNHCR do its work in slightly better conditions by not simply by defending them against unjustified accusations, but in also highlighting the many good things they are doing and benefiting from their information in order to disseminate facts and figures that would counter a narrative that tends to be at times xenophobic. I won't make a speech, so but I think that there are three issues I would like to raise, and I'm sure you will address them through your talk, and they will be discussed in the subsequent time given to the audience for questions and comments. One, I'm sure you're aware of the constant mantra of a number of Lebanese politicians that regarding an alleged international conspiracy to settle Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And whatever the international community does, whatever UNHCR does, is often looked at from the lens of this exaggerated fear. And one has to deal with that. I mean, fear is not rational, it's not always justified, but it exists, and one has to deal with it as intelligently and even respectfully of the simple people that do not exaggerate, do not fabricate, but are the victims of exaggerations and fabrication. The second issue is that Lebanon, and this is again and repeated ad nauseam by some of our political leaders, Lebanon is not a signatory of the 1951 Convention and the 1967 protocols and the rest. And therefore, some people would like to think of our country as being exempt from any rights-based approach to the refugee issues. And I forget that there is a number of principles that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration, in many other international conventions other than the 1951 Refugee Convention, that Lebanon is a signatory to, and it has to be fully aware of its obligation as a country to protect refugees. So a rights-based approach to the problem of refugees has been extremely difficult. In this country, there was a controversy around a word which means a lot regarding return, while we often use the word voluntary return. There are those who think that this word is unacceptable to them. They always found alternative words, safe return, whatever it is. But there's not a semantic battle. It's a political one, and some of us fear that this insistence on not using the word voluntary might hide the temptation of not respecting scrupulously the principle of no refoulement, which is a principle in customary international law. It's a principle that we need and we have to adhere to. So that's another issue for us to think about. Now, last but not least is the return of Syrian refugees to Syria. And I think much of the discussion tends to overshadow a primary determinant of the return or the lack thereof, that is the policy of the Syrian regime. I mean, all the discussion is about the international community, whether the return should happen after reconstruction begins, and reconstruction shouldn't take place unless there is a political solution to the Syria crisis. All of this is important, of course, but there is a determining factor in allowing the Syrian refugees to return home. That is, the Syrian regime stated and unavowed policies regarding this issue. I mean, many of us are convinced that that's the main obstacle. The Syrian regime is not necessarily in favor of a return of the refugees for a variety of reasons I need not enter into. It's an economic burden, perhaps, for them. It might disturb the demographic engineering they are involved in. And then it's a series of practices a repressive regime is used to. People are arrested at the borders, and all the rest. So the conditions for return are not there. There was this Russian so-called initiative. There were Russian ideas. It was not real initiative. And the Russians soon realized that their ideas are difficult to implement, and they have been discreet about what they think are the real reasons. In private conversations with Russian officials, I can testify to this, they admit that short of putting pressure on the Syrian regime, nothing of that will happen. It's not just about donors, it's not about Germany giving money or whatever country giving enough funds to allow the return of the refugees. It's about also the Syrian government dealing with the refugee issue in a different manner, to say the least. So these are some of the controversies we have in Lebanon, and now we're busy dealing with our budget and austerity measures and economic reforms and what have you. So the debate over the Syrian refugee presence in Lebanon is not as hot and as it was in previous times, but it will come back. So let's hear your wisdom on the matter, and then we'll open the floor.
Well, thank you very much for, first of all, for hosting this event and for giving us a chance to talk about what I think is an intersection between some of the global developments, some of the regional developments, and of course also some of the national developments, because actually it's very interesting that all of this somewhat intersect at different levels, and I think one can certainly see it play out in the context of the Syria situation, including, of course, the refugee and the displacement situation, and where you have mentioned some of these very important points that I'm sure we will discuss, not just in my presentation, but also I think in the conversation with all of you. The topic is actually the Global Compact, so I'll start with the global dimension. And I don't know to what extent you're familiar with the Global Compact on Refugees. It's a document that was actually negotiated with all 193 member states of the United Nations. But let me give you a little bit of a history on this, because I think it's important to know the historical context. I think if we look at the UN, one of the first General Assembly resolutions that was ever adopted in 1946 was about refugees. And it recognized, that was an important recognition, that international refugee issues are international in scope and character. It was an important recognition. Of course, it was born out of the experience of what happened in the wake of the Second World War, with massive displacement happening in many parts of the world, but particularly in Europe. I mean, I think the estimate was that there were about 60 million people on the move in Europe in different contexts. I think when we look at some of the discussions that we have today in Europe, I think we sometimes forget that historical context. 60 million people on the move. And it's important to bear that in mind. So when the United Nations was formed in the wake of the Second World War, there was that recognition that refugee matters are not just cannot be dealt with by one country alone. They are a concern to the international community as a whole. I think that was very important. We then had, as you know, a legal framework that was established. You mentioned one of the core norms of that. There's the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. It contains the principle of non-refoulement that you mentioned, which today is indeed a norm of customary international law, irrespective of whether a country has subscribed to it or not. It is part and parcel of the principles of conduct that states have to adhere to. And that principle of non-refoulement is sacrosanct. It has to be respected. There's no, in fact, when we sometimes use the refoulement or the non-refoulement argument, states are always very keen to point out that they have not violated that principle. Of course, then the question is, what does it concretely mean in different contexts? So that's very important. If you look at the last 20 years or so, it is interesting. You have a lot of population movements that happened with different reasons behind it. I mean, of course, in the 90s, if one looks at from a bird's eye view at the 90s, you will, of course, see former Yugoslavia. So it affected Europe in a massive way. Massive population movements within Europe, particularly Western Europe and Southeastern Europe. Then you had the Great Lakes with Rwanda, with the genocide in Rwanda in particular, you had again massive displacement movements. You had, of course, Somalia. You had ongoing movements out of Afghanistan, different movements within also in the Myanmar context, Southeast Asia. And then suddenly in the 2000s, you know, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, you had a lot of returns. Solutions were found. We had peace agreements that were signed, Dayton Peace Agreement in the context of Yugoslavia. You had very difficult situation, of course, in the context of the Great Lakes, and we still have actually a lot of refugees, certainly from DRC outside, from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, you have ongoing issues now with Burundi and so forth. So you have different situations where they change. Some of the people manage to return. Some of the people are still either displaced for a second or third time. You then had massive returns to Afghanistan, beginning of the 2000s. And suddenly we thought, well, maybe return is really one of the big solutions that come back. Unfortunately, many of those who returned are probably back now in Iran and Pakistan or elsewhere, because they could not find a solution inside Afghanistan. So that's one of the issues. And then if you look at sort of the period from 2005 to 2010, we did not have major emergencies. I remember with previous current Secretary General, previous High Commissioner, Antonio Guterres, I mean, during this initial period of his tenure, we had IDP emergencies, we had of course Iraq as a very difficult issue, but we didn't really have massive emergencies. They really started again in 2011. And ever since, the numbers have gone up and gone up and gone up. I mean, of course, it was with Libya, but then very quickly we moved to Syria. We saw what happened in the context of a number of situations on the African continent, South Sudan. I mean, you had a sort of a succession of crises, including the most recent one with Myanmar and 1 million Rohingya refugees into Bangladesh. You have an ongoing displacement. You have about 3.6 million Venezuelans who have left the country over the last 2 years. So you have a succession of crises that in a way produce population movements. And of course, in the Syria refugee context, you had massive internal displacement. I mean, there's different figures, but I mean, we are still talking about over 6 million internally displaced. You have 5.6 million refugees in the neighboring countries, and Lebanon, and the credit goes to Lebanon, to the Lebanese society and to Lebanon for hosting the largest number of refugees in terms of, if one looks at the population and the comparison with the population. Because of course Turkey is the largest host country for refugees in terms of absolute numbers, but in terms of correlation between population as well as refugees, it is of course Lebanon. And I think, I think there is an incredible admiration and appreciation on the part of the UN, on the part of the international community towards what Lebanon has been doing over the last 8 years. And it has to be recognized, and it's important to bear that in mind. When in 2015, we had a very contradictory development. Quite interesting, actually, if one looks back at 2015. We suddenly had a movement particularly triggered by the Syria situation, that started to affect Europe in a massive way. I mean, I know I'm looking at some of my European colleagues. Suddenly, Europe discovered that refugees also come to Europe again. For quite some time, they were not used to the fact that people come in large numbers. I mean, you had almost 1 million from the Eastern Mediterranean who went through Turkey to Greece, the Western Balkans route to different countries, especially Germany, Sweden, and Austria at the time, with a very vexed discussion inside Europe about how to deal with this. And I think we Europeans had to very quickly reinvent what it is and what solidarity means in Europe, and I think with a very mixed result, unfortunately, but that's what it is. We also had, interestingly, in 2015, a number of successes at the multilateral level. You had the Paris Climate Agreement, You had the adoption of the Sustainable Development Agenda, which was quite a feast. It was quite a difficult negotiation process, but it was adopted in 2015. You had, in the displacement context, also the Nansen Protection Agenda for people displaced as a result of environmental degradation, climate change, external displacement, that was adopted by 109 states, not by the whole of the international community, but by quite a number of very important countries as well. So we actually thought, interesting. So multilateralism comes back to become a strong force. In 2016, because it was felt that indeed the international community needs to come together also on refugee and migration issues, you had the adoption at the leaders' level in New York of the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, which, you know, maybe a couple of years earlier would have been impossible. You would not have gotten at the heads of government, heads of state level, a declaration adopted by all 193 member states that was really re-emphasizing very much the principles of what needs to be done, focusing on some of the elements, developing a comprehensive refugee response framework, and asking UNHCR to develop a global compact on refugees, which is why, I mean, this discussion is taking place. And over the last 2 years, we developed with member states and with civil society and other actors this so-called global compact on refugees that you have before you, which was quite, I mean, from an international relations and international law perspective, quite interesting that actually member states asked a UN organization to develop that compact on the basis of experience that we have had over the years in different refugee situations. And in fact, we had a rollout of this comprehensive refugee response in about 15 countries in different regions of the world. And we very much, and I can say this because I was involved in the development of the Global Compact, we looked, of course, very much at the situation, the Syria situation, and what neighboring countries have been doing. So the experience of Lebanon comes in as a very important experience that actually has informed, in many ways, what you currently have in this document. That lasted for about 2 years. And we had an approach where we had informal discussions with countries and the various partners and civil society actors, but then also formal consultations last year that in the end led to the affirmation of the Global Compact on Refugees by the UN General Assembly, which was adopted through a GA resolution that was put to a vote, which is a bit unusual because normally humanitarian type of GA resolutions do not get put to a vote, but it was put to a vote. And we had only 2 countries that voted against it. We had 3 countries that abstained, and all other countries voted in favor of it, including Lebanon and Syria, and all the neighboring countries of Syria as well. It's interesting. So they voted in favor, and they were very much engaged. The Lebanese mission was very much engaged in the development of this Global Compact. But what is it actually? And again, the historical perspective is quite interesting. Because on the one hand, we have a very strong legal framework on the protection of people for refugees, people who cannot return because of conflict, because of human rights violations, because of persecution. And on the other hand, when countries are faced with a massive influx, they cannot really rely on a predictable framework of cooperation from the international community. And that's quite interesting because if you go into the preamble of the 51 Convention, it says that matters that require international cooperation, it does require, in order to be able to host refugees, it does require international cooperation of sorts. But we never defined it. We have had many practices over many years in different country contexts. Some of you who follow international relations will remember the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Indo-Chinese refugees. You had there was a comprehensive plan for refugees in the former Yugoslavia. You had a lot of different ad hoc type of arrangements, but you actually we never managed as an international community to put into words and into text what does it actually mean when a country receives large numbers of refugees or receives refugees in a protracted period. I mean, many refugee situations today, I mean, Afghanistan, Somalia, many others are actually in a very protracted, I mean, sometimes 30 years, if one looks at, in fact, more than 30 years in the context of Afghanistan. So the question is, what do we do? How can we as international community give some content to what the GA in 1946 said? It is international in scope and character. And that's what actually the GCR tries to do. It essentially puts forward that no country can do it on its own. It does require international support. It deals with the immediate emergency concerns that countries face when they have a large-scale influx. It also deals with the so-called humanitarian development nexus, because there is, of course, humanitarian action, there is the protection side of things, but there's also the development side of things. I mean, access to education, access to healthcare, infrastructural help is something that comes normally from the development actors. And it defines what was often a gap, or identified as a gap, it defines the humanitarian development nexus in a very concrete way, because it goes into quite some details about how actually to bridge what used to be and was perceived to be a gap. It also links it up with the Sustainable Development Agenda, because of course the mantra of the Sustainable Development Agenda is that no one should be left behind. I mean, as we know, including in the Lebanon context, if you look at the amount of refugees who fall below the poverty line and even below the extreme poverty line, these are sizable numbers, and no country and the international community as a whole cannot afford to lose populations in this manner. And that's really where this document comes in and provides a very concrete ideas of how to resolve it. Of course, one can say this is just a text negotiated by diplomats who sit in Geneva and then go to New York and adopt a nice text. Well, actually, it is much more than that, because, I mean, this is lived reality out there that we have even seen over the last 2 years that has affected the lives of people, and both of refugee communities as well as host communities, because one of the recognitions in here is also that it is not just about refugees, it is also about the impact that refugee movements have on host communities, and how can we mitigate it and how can we deal with this. So this concept of responsibility sharing has come in as a very, very strong aspect, and that's really what the Global Compact tries to address. It wants to put forward a more predictable way of the international community to deal with refugee movements in a much more equitable manner, so that it really asks of each and every one of us, both at the society level, at the international community level, at the partnership level, to come forward and see what can they contribute to refugee issues. It also manages to sustain political attention, because, you know, I remember in 2015, for instance, some of the countries in Europe did not have to deal with refugees. Some of the leaders of these countries actually did not know much about refugee issues at the time, because they didn't have to deal with it. They had to almost get a crash course in refugee matters, because suddenly this became a huge political issue. And we know that, you know, the memory often is not very long, and what this compact tries to do is to actually have a mechanism in place that the international community has to give it sustained political attention, because we often have seen when a new crisis emerges that the attention goes. So this actually ensures through a number of mechanisms that this international attention cannot go away. We cannot forget refugee situations, especially when they are in a protracted situation. It also puts forward a strong partnership model. And quite frankly, for us, one of the biggest game changers has been the World Bank engagement, the World Bank group, including for middle-income countries. And Lebanon has benefited from that. In fact, At the New York summit, the World Bank, the then World Bank president, Dr. Kim, announced two major initiatives. One was a global concessional financing facility for middle-income countries, precisely taking into account the situation of Lebanon and Jordan, but also a so-called refugee sub-window for a financial instrument for the least developing countries, which is called IDA 18, which is 2 billion development funds. This is not humanitarian funds, development funds for those countries that are most affected by refugee situations. And quite frankly, this shows that it is displacement and refugee movements are taken into account by the international community. But it's not just the World Bank Group and the international financial institutions. It is also, of course, what we have traditionally all worked with, civil society, the NGOs, the academic. We actually want to build an academic alliance because we know that also with academic institutions, and I think we have seen a number of very good examples here with a fantastic publication that came out by this institute here on refugee issues. I think that's the type of evidence base that we need in our interaction with academics, but also the private sector. The private sector has come in not just in terms of resource mobilization, but also in terms of interest in investing in those areas of countries where people are most affected, both host communities and refugees. You have very interesting Jordan Compact on employment, for example, that looks at investments taking place in Jordan, but also in Ethiopia, but also to some extent here, to ensure that employment opportunities arise both for host communities, but also for refugees. So there are a number of quite good examples that we have seen. Also the recognition of the local authorities and the municipal authorities, because very often they are at the forefront of the response. I mean, there's a clear recognition. I think you have that also in the Lebanon context, where really the local and the municipal authorities, I mean, they are the ones who actually have to make sure that electricity, water, and so forth is taken into account. So that recognition is much stronger in this document than ever before. So I think all in all, a very strong document that we see being implemented as we speak. I mean, again, learning very much from the Lebanon experience. But also, and you mentioned the solutions aspect, with strong language on solutions. And solutions almost seeing whatever is done for refugees and as an investment in the future of a country. Because whatever you do for the Syrian refugees in Lebanon is an investment in the future of Syria, but also an investment in the future of Lebanon, because it is two neighboring countries. I mean, these countries are obviously interlinked, but it's the same for Jordan, it's the same for Turkey, it's the same for everyone else who is affected. Because if refugees learn their skills, have vocational training abilities, have access to education, learn about community cohesion, it was very instructive for me to talk to refugees here in Lebanon who told me that the community cohesion here is so much stronger than perhaps it was back then when they were in Syria. But they will, if return happens, they will bring this back. And we know in other situations, and I just want to give you one example and I will end with this, that refugee communities, if we see it as an investment, especially for them to get on with their lives, an investment in the future of countries of origin, which is also of benefit to the region or to the neighboring countries, it will really change the mindset. Because whatever we do for them here will make sure that, for instance, when return becomes possible for many, will be a massive investment in sustainable return of people who elect to do so. I just want to give you an example of another region, and that's where I want to end. So El Salvador. And it came out, I was reminded of that example when I talked to Syrian refugees here in Lebanon. Of course, El Salvador had a terrible civil war. You had refugees outside El Salvador. When after the end of the civil war, you had a period of reconstruction and rebuilding and making sure that development cooperation starts. But then a couple of years later, you had this phenomenon, this social phenomenon, that in some neighborhoods, they suddenly got controlled by violent gangs, by violent groups. It's interesting. We did a mapping to understand this phenomenon better. Wherever former refugee communities returned to El Salvador, they were free from violence. So the establishment of some of these gangs did not work in former refugee communities who returned and who found the social cohesion that they developed in exile when they went back. And that really is actually a glimmer of hope also for the Syria situation. And I think it's chapeau to Lebanon and to what you're doing for Syrians, because in a way we hope, and I very strongly got that feeling today when talking to refugees here, that they will be the future peace builders of the country. And that's a huge investment in the interest of course, Syria, but also in the interest of Lebanon. So this gives you a very quick, bit of a longer historical, but also future background of this famous global compact on refugees.
Well, thank you very much for this overview, but mostly for this forward-looking idea that you explicited at the end, that in investing in refugees today is an investment for the future, that the social cohesion that they may develop here would help them when the time comes to go back and live more peacefully in their own country. Thank you very much for all of this. The floor is open for comments, for questions, for suggestions. Yes? Micro. Where is the micro? Is it coming? يلا هون بالصف نزلي شوي 5 فشخات فوالا.
Hello, thank you for this comprehensive overview. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how the nexus between development and the humanitarian development nexus is defined in the Global Compact, and what mechanisms are in place or are envisioned to ensure and uphold this nexus.
Would you comment on this and then give the others the time to prepare their questions? Yeah.
It's actually very interesting when, the world is sometimes divided into different boxes. So you have the humanitarian box and you have the development box. And what happened is that somehow these boxes didn't really talk to each other. And it has been for many years, actually, for quite a long time. I remember previous High Commissioner Sadako Ogata, when at some stage was so frustrated with it in the end of the 90s in the Yugoslavia context that she said, well, we need to, and she had a discussion with the then World Bank President Wolfens, while she had the Brookings Institute work out how to bridge this gap between relief and development. And I think what we realize is that a lot of the development policies do not take into account the fact that displacement happens in a country. And I mean, for instance, middle-income countries like Lebanon, Jordan, or like now with the Venezuela situation, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, would not qualify for some of the financial instruments that the World Bank Group would provide. And yet you have 1 million people arrive in the country. So how can that be? Jordan, the same, with water scarcity and infrastructure issues and so forth. I mean, how can we deal with the impact on a country that affects infrastructure, the education system, the health system, the water system, whatever you need in order to provide basic services to a population. So it was usually done by the humanitarian community, and that is, I'm not saying you diminish that work, that is absolutely crucial, but you need to find ways and means that it is complemented and supported much earlier on through development cooperation as well. But bringing in the host community aspects too, and that I think is what is so, in a way, new, because in the past there was a lot of focus on, I mean, we always talked about host communities, but the socioeconomic impact on host communities was not really analyzed in the same way as it is today. I mean, we have quite an interesting study that was done, I think, by the World Bank here as well on the mobility of displaced Syrians, and I understand there are more studies forthcoming on this, and they really teach us quite a lot about how, and give us the evidence base that you said is perhaps also very necessary when we have a very heated public political debate, because you do have the evidence and the facts here and in other documents as well. So what is interesting is, since this debate started on the Global Compact for the last 2 years, you have seen very quickly, particularly the World Bank, come to grips with how to change the financial instruments in order to take into account the effect of displacement. There's a paper that was done, I think, 2 years ago about precisely this issue. And that really required them to look at their financial instruments and how can they adapt these financial instruments to a reality of displacement. And these are financial instruments that go into development issues. And it's usually cooperation with ministries of finance, with ministries of planning, with development cooperation partners. It's not the usual humanitarian action that is done through UN agencies and non-governmental organizations, the civil society. And we just did a calculation over the last 2 years in terms of additional development cooperation that was made available worldwide is about 6.5 billion. Because it's not just what came in from the World Bank, but also from what countries managed to find in addition to their normal development cooperation in terms of what they do in their bilateral development cooperation. In the Rohingya situation, just to give you another example, Myanmar, Bangladesh, I remember the discussions, we had the influx in August 2017. Within a couple of months, the World Bank started looking at it immediately and actually started to release funding already in 2018, purely on making sure that some of the most affected areas, education, health, get the support that they need. The same with the Asia Development Bank. We never had that before. So it is a combination of multilateral financial institutions plus the bilateral, what countries do in their bilateral cooperation through their development funding that took into account the forced displacement dimension. And you know, from a protection perspective, it's of course extremely important, because if you manage to bring electricity to a camp in Rwanda, Mahama, for example, where we had Burundian refugees, which also benefits the host community, a lot of the protection issues that you normally face are going to be addressed, because you actually have light and you have the possibility for children to access education and so forth. And this type of collaboration has really started through the Global Compact. I mean, through these discussions, and this is a reflection of reality. So it's really what has come out in the different contexts of what countries face and how can we deal with it in a different way. And we have at the end of this year the Global Refugee Forum, which is one of these mechanisms to ensure that we have sustained political attention. It's all 193 member states will come together in Geneva at ministerial level, and each and every member state will be asked what it is that they can do and showcase to the refugee cause. Of course, for Lebanon, you can showcase a lot, and you can also be clear about what the needs are. But other countries that are not affected by refugee movements, they will have to think hard what it is that they can contribute, both in terms of resettlement, complementary pathways, in terms of private sector engagement, in terms of funding, in order to help countries that are particularly affected. So this will give us a chance to really advance this in a much more predictable manner.
Thanks. Professor Adib.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for the nice talk. My name is Salim Adib. I'm a professor of public health practice at this university here, and so directly concerned with a major issue in the protection of refugees, which is health. But also, I have another hat. I'm part of the executive committee of a new reformist party that would like to be the political expression of the civil society. And we're facing a challenge in writing a policy brief on refugees in Lebanon because of all the contradictions, the feelings, the fears, the perceptions that my friend Tarek Mitri has touched upon. And so my question is the following. This is yet a new document that you're going to propose to the Lebanese government. And we're fully aware that the Lebanese government has already mishandled this process at several times. And so my question is, what are the new obligations or the new expectations that you expect from the Lebanese government? And what are some of the things that you would like to see repaired so that we can move on the coming 5, 10, 15 years, who knows, without having major upheavals in the land?
Yes?
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, to you?
Thank you very much. Bjarte Bjørsvik. I wonder, what does the Global Compact offer Lebanon, and what are the limitations as far as you see them?
Good. Let's take those. Yes, please. Take a third question.
So one of the goals, I think, in the compact was to increase the resettlement places available. And as you know, the resettlement numbers have been going down, especially since the U.S. cut their numbers, and the U.S. also didn't agree to the compact. So do you see that the compact can actually have any impact in this regard?
Yes?
Hello, I'm a journalist. My question is, you was in Syria and you came to Lebanon yesterday, as I know. Did you meet Bashar al-Assad, and did you talk about the refugees? Are they welcomed in Syria again, or they don't want them anymore? What about the refugees who returned? Did you meet them, and was you allowed to see them in their villages, or what happened? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have another round, so please.
So I think I'm glad, by the way, the World Health Organization, as a result of all of this, also you looked at a framework decision or a framework action plan on health for refugees and migrants. So again, what this has triggered is each and every system of the UN and beyond, and civil society. I mean, we had so many discussions with so many different partners around the world to actually see what is it that they can contribute within their remit, within their responsibility. And I think it has really triggered that awareness, because in the past, quite frankly, sometimes refugee issues were a niche issue. So when, of course, the country gets confronted with, like Lebanon, I mean, you, of course, know very well what it means for the health system and for the health institutions. But I think that experience is exactly the one that we need also to be replicated and borne in mind for other countries. So I think your experience on the health front will be very important. You see, if I have one wish where this comes in the context of Lebanon, is to ensure that an issue that is sensitive is not part of politics, in the sense that it really goes back to the individual human being. And I mean, for us who are confronted, and I mean, those of you who are engaged with refugees, who see them on a daily basis, who listen to their stories. I mean, I met a Syrian widowed female-headed, she's heading a household with 6 kids. Her husband died. She's a concierge. I think in an apartment building here in Beirut. And she was telling us when her husband, who was the concierge before, got a salary, he got a certain amount. She does exactly the same, is afraid to leave her house because she fears that at some stage she may not be accepted by the building anymore. Immediately her salary was halved. I mean, it is really putting, you know, the human story of the individual who is in front of us, and making sure that that understanding is there, because we see it, and this is not, you know, this is unfortunately a trend that we see in so many countries around the world, that there is a bit of a vilification of the other. And of course, refugees are often a very easy scapegoat for many things. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't take fears into account or perceptions, but we need to deal with them. And we need to deal with them in all of the country contexts where we work. I mean, you know, we have sometimes absurd discussions in countries in Europe. I mean, you mentioned, I mean, you have absurd discussions where actually the numbers are extremely minimal, and if you talk to the population, they have the impression that they are going to be invaded tomorrow, which is not at all the case. And I think it's a question of everyone within the society to ensure that we counter that. You are in a different situation. You have 1 million people here. That's clear. But it is also clear, and I think I liked the publication from this institute that put some facts and figures to the current refugee situation, which was also debunking some of the myths. In fact, that's, I think, a very important publication that will hopefully also inform the public debate, because it actually talks about facts and figures. I mean, it was when I think it was published earlier last year. I think it really is an important contribution to. So I hope that, you know, when it comes to refugee issues, that we go back to the individual human being, that we try to see their fate, that we get the facts and figures right, and that we see what we do for them, not just in the human interest, but also, quite frankly, in the interest of a broader investment in our own future and in the future of the neighboring country. What does it offer? I think the Global Compact offers, and that's very important, that there will be sustained attention paid to the refugee situation. Because, as I was mentioning earlier, we often see that once a new crisis emerges, we move on and things get forgotten. And we can't afford this in a situation like this. I mean, the Brussels conference that took place, when was it, a couple of weeks ago, actually, and that was very positive, the sustained funding that comes from it is still there. And in a way, the fact that we have a framework of this kind makes sure that it does not get ignored. It is actually considered as something that needs constant attention. So in a way, that is a framework that helps ensure that Lebanon gets the support that it will require now and also in the future. And it does talk about solutions. And I think the solutions includes return in safety and dignity, and on the basis of a free and informed choice. I think that's also a very important element. I mean, it talks about the solutions orientation and how to deal with it and how to actually make sure that we can work on some of those issues as well. What are the limitations? The limitations, and these are not obligations, it's a non-binding document. It is really, it's building on if you like, goodwill and commitments, but it also creates some peer pressure. We hope that countries come to the fore and think through what they can do in order to contribute to the cause. Resettlement, yes, resettlement we have seen, I mean, over the last couple of years, it's actually interesting. If you take the long-term horizon, we managed to resettle about 1 million refugees over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years. So over the last 10 years, it is 1 million refugees that were resettled. Which, you know, of course some will say this is not enough. But, and this is worldwide. This is not a figure for Lebanon. This is a figure for worldwide, for different refugee situations. And we have seen sometimes countries lower their quotas. We have sometimes seen countries improve them again. I mean, I remember when the current Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, came in, he wanted to have, what was it, 25,000 Syrian refugees to be resettled. In the past, that was not even a discussion point with Canada. So sometimes we get these surprises. We have seen the US is still the largest resettlement country, despite the fact that they actually lowered the current quota. It is still the largest resettlement country, and I think we need to recognize this. And we hope also that there will be more partners joining the group of about 30 countries or so that are currently providing resettlement places. So our hope is that through this, we will be able to broaden the base of support beyond the traditional partners. Because it is, I mean, if you look at the current situation, it is too few. They are not enough. We want to challenge countries that are not contributing at this stage, whether they can't do it. So we will hope, again, I think the ambition is to at least achieve 1 million resettlement, 1 million refugees to be resettled in the next 10 years, if not more, because we also want to look at private sponsorship initiatives, family reunification possibilities, and so forth. I mean, to really broaden whatever we can on the third country solution side. On Syria, so we had discussions with the Syrian government, not with the president. We, of course, also had discussions about return issues. I felt that this was a very frank discussion about some of the issues that we face, including on civil documents, for example. I mean, some of the things that refugees tell us when they return. I think there was a clear message that indeed they want to work with us on issues of those who choose to return, to find a way to support them. I had a chance to visit one area, Sabadan, where I had a chance to visit that, which, you know, the destruction was quite striking. It was about 80% of that particular town that was destroyed. But you had also people who actually managed to return. And for us, it's very important, again, that we focus very much on the people, on what they need, on the livelihood issues that they have, on the documentation issues that they face, and that we find ways and means to engage, because obviously they have opted to return, and they want to do that, and we just need to find ways and means to support it for those who, on the basis, as I said, have free and informed choice to come back.
You know, as I read the Global Compact, it states 4 objectives.
That's right. Yeah.
And if I look at them with my Lebanese spectacles, then what do I see? I see that that the international community, one, is to ease pressures on host countries. The international community has tried to do that. Of course, the word ease pressure is relative. I mean, it's an elastic notion, easing pressure. So some of us realize that pressure is being eased, and others think that it has not been eased enough. But something has happened on that front, that no one can deny. We can argue about the impact, the magnitude of the impact. The second objective is enhance refugee self-reliance. Again, I mean, there has been tremendous efforts by HCR, but also by NGOs, international and local. Expand access, this is third, expand access to third country solutions. Now, we know the limits. We've perhaps, I would hate to use the word, reached the limits, but I don't think we have high hopes that there will be third countries that will receive significant numbers of Syrian refugees. Then the fourth is support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. And this is where I think there is a deficit in clarity as to what these conditions are and what could be done. And as I said in my opening remarks, this is one of the most divisive issues in Lebanon. You have those who say, look, the conditions for return are there, let them go back. Voluntary or non-voluntary, this is an academic issue, they would say. And then you have those who would say, look, there are minimal conditions, security conditions, livelihood-related conditions that are not there. So after you visit, this is putting your question in a different way. I mean, after you visit, you had the impression that there might be conditions for a return, and all you need is to just give a little support to Syria.
Well, perhaps let me comment on this, because perhaps first, I think there is also, I mean, the office here has done a quite interesting brochure on global compact and the type of good practices that we saw here in a bit like what you have just done, looking at the objectives of the compact and what does it say in the Lebanon context. And I think this is quite useful because a lot of good practices from this operation and from this situation have actually influenced the global debate. I think it's very important to bear that in mind. Look, when it comes to return, it's actually interesting what the Global Compact says about return, because it says, for example, I mean, first of all, it makes it absolutely clear that it is about voluntariness. It's a free and informed choice. Voluntariness means free and informed. Free and informed. I think it's important to bear in mind what these words actually mean. It also talks about safety. I mean, of course, it has to be safe, and it has to be dignity. I mean, dignity means material safety, but also ways for people to rebuild their lives. It does say that there are situations, and I'm just trying to find it. Let me just... What it does say as well, and that's interesting. Sorry. Just need to... It is equally recognized that there are situations where refugees voluntarily return outside the context of formal voluntary repatriation programs, and that this requires support. And I think that's where we are at the moment. I mean, we need to support. I think it's our obligation. If people want to return and they elect to return on the basis of a free and informed choice, it is clear that we cannot ignore that. We need to support it. And it is equally important for us to engage with the country of origin on the types of concerns that we hear from the people who don't know at this stage whether they want to go back or not. And, you know, I mean, for instance, one of the things that is very important here is civil documentation. The fact that you actually register births fixes an identity. It is purely, it's not, because I think there's also a confusion sometimes that you know, birth certificates and the issuance of it's not at all about nationality. Yeah? And because you mentioned conspiracy theories, absolutely not. Birth certificates, issuance of birth certificates, is a fundamental right that applies to any human being irrespective of nationality. That's what the Convention on the Rights of the Child says. Because you just make sure that that person is legally existing by registering, by recording the fact of birth. That's all. And that's very important. I mean, we know, that's also interesting, a number of people told me in Syria that they have huge issues about authentication of death, for example, or authentication of marriages. Because that has then, and sometimes these seem so trivial things, but they have huge impact on property issues, on people's lives, on all kinds of things. And in a way, I mean, the investment that we have also done here, and I think there were instructions that were issued by Lebanon to ensure that, yes, refugee children, we need to record their birth, which also says which nationality they have, Syrian nationality. And that's very important because it will be, whatever we do in the future and whatever happens when people return, they will need these type of documents. So I just want to perhaps say that because we are in this in between.
Salim? No. That's
also
let's have Salim and then okay.
I'm really sorry. I beg to differ that although we want to keep politics out of the issue, politics will invite itself into the issue, because whether we think of it, we think of the refugee issue as being a humanitarian problem or not, it's irrelevant because we have political parties who will want to cover up a failure in government by finding a scapegoat, and the scapegoat is ready, it's there. So we really, the issue is how much pressure can be done on a government that does not want to look at the issue outside the box. For example, for sure, if we do not invest in the development of the new generation of Syrian refugees born in Lebanon, they will never be able to leave. Third countries will never want to take them. They will never find a place if they return to Syria. And we already have, every year, the amount of babies that are born to Syrian refugees, whether documented or not, in Lebanon surpasses the amount of those that find a way to go back to Syria. And so we need political pressure on a government that does not want to see the way out. And that's where the UN is failing us, because it's always a conversation with governments and never, it's kind of a gentleman's conversation, but there is no teeth to it. And we need to be pushed to do the right thing. Feelings.
More? Yes, Madam.
My name is Hermine Schellen. I'm with Universal Peace Federation. And we have been working for almost 5 years with refugees, Syrian refugees, in a refugee camp. So first I want to say I really appreciate to have UNHCR, especially here in Lebanon. They've been doing amazing aid programs and helping so many refugees. Still, I have one question, because lately I've been really talking to the refugees, asking them, why don't you go back to Syria? You know, you are living in a terrible situation in these tents. It's so horrible how they live, you know. And they all were saying the same thing to me. They said, we don't have the money. If we have the money, we would go back immediately. They want to go back to Syria. So my question, Monsieur Turk, is there a way to help these families who don't have any money to go back, but they really want to go back to Syria, and they live in such a terrible situation? Thank you.
Thank you. Second.
Hello, my name is Amy. I work for Humanity and Inclusion. Oh, I'm supposed to pass it?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I have a question about unexploded ordnance and in how far in the conversation with Damascus this was an issue at all, considering that currently there are 165 incidents per day, and most populated areas in Syria are contaminated with severity level 3 and above. And in a similar vein, what UNHCR's position is when it comes to risk education in neighboring countries, so to Syrian people that are in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Turkey, how to deal with an explosive ordinance when you find one. How do you see that in relation to durable solutions and return? Thank you, and sorry for hogging it.
Somebody? Yes?
Hi. Thank you for the presentation and the discussion. My name is Valeria, I work here for SF, Action Against Hunger. I have a question, a bit of a provocation maybe, about like how can we state that there are like voluntary returns that are not organized and informal, given that in Lebanon the only solution that is actually possible is return, because integration and durable solution in country are not actually possible. Then the situation described before, I don't see it as a like, let's give refugees money so that they can go back to Syria because this is what they want. It is that here we are unable to assist them in a safe and dignified way, to give them a proper choice to either stay or return when they feel that that will be more appropriate. So how can we actually monitor, given the limited access we also have in Syria right now, that people that are returning right now are doing that because they are informed, because it is their choice, and it's not because of other push factors that exist here. Thank you.
We'll take another question or comment here. Yes?
Hi. You mentioned that through your understanding of Lebanon, or through your experience visiting Lebanon in the past few days, that you were able to identify specific situations that have been approved through the Global Compact on Refugees. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on specific examples where you have seen the nexus between the Global Compact on Refugees and improved situation in Lebanon for refugees or for the host state. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I think we'll have your concluding replies to these 4 questions. And any additional comment you'd like to make.
Yes. No, thank you very much. And I think the biggest conundrum that we face, not just here, everywhere, is precisely how to bring the voice of reason into a political debate. And I can only repeat, of course, it takes place in a political part. It's part of politics, but at the same time, in order to ensure that we have a positive impact on the people who are directly affected by it, and that's not just in the refugee discourse, that's also in other areas, facts and figures and evidence are the best antidote. I think it's then for politics to ensure that this gets translated into something that doesn't harm people. In fact, maybe produces something positive for people, including for the host society, not just for the refugees. But you know, I'm not a politician, so I hope that the tradecraft of politics is such that it can actually do the right thing. Look, if there are people who want to go back, please let us know, and our office know here, because of course we want to engage with them. And in fact, I know that the operation, my colleagues here who are, in fact, you have the representative, Mimi Gerard, with us, and Carolina with the deputy. I mean, if there are people who want to go, please inform our office, and we will immediately look into this and see what we can do. Because if people really want to go back, well, we'll be there to make sure that we can support it. On mining, yes, I think that's a huge issue. I think the colleague who was asking about the demining issue, and it's one area where we have also been in touch with the UN Mine Action Service, because indeed in some areas we will absolutely need to ensure that type of program is being done, because otherwise you have, I mean, one of the first questions when I went to Sabadani was actually what is the situation in the rural areas, in the agricultural areas about demining. I mean, I was assured that this was cleared. It was actually cleared by the Syrian authorities. But it's clear that with what's been happening and what has happened, it is huge. And I don't know to what extent I would have to, my colleagues, I don't know, I think we probably work on risk mitigation, but maybe we can have a separate discussion with yourself about that. I think there's always going to be a balancing act on push and pull factors. I think we need to recognize that there are push factors and there are pull factors. And for us, it's very important to ensure that, and that's what is so crucial, that we create a space where people can take a free and informed choice, and that we mitigate especially any push factors. I mean, we have had some discussions about this within the operation, but also with the authorities here, because of course this may be a short-term gain for some, but in the long term it won't work. In fact, it will bring people back probably in a worse situation, and it will actually be a social problem for our country. So I think if we can argue this through and make sure that we influence this as much as possible, that's going to be very important. So we will have to look very carefully at these different factors and how they interact and how it plays out at the very individual level of the person who maybe says certain things, but also needs to ensure that they know what the consequences are of that decision and how we can support it. Concretely, the fact, very concretely, the fact that the World Bank got involved here by providing through the concessional financing facility is very important. The fact that you had, I don't know what the overall number is over the last couple of years in terms of resettlement I know it's a drop in the ocean, but it is still, I think last year it was about 10,000 people who were resettled, some of the most vulnerable among them. That's very important. So resettlement, family reunification possibilities that we have from here. The fact that you actually have a very good coverage of both what needs to be done at the local level for access to fundamental humanitarian needs, that we have a cash assistance program that supports the most vulnerable, because that's also not, what is it? It's 19% of the population gets cash assistance. The most vulnerable of them is very important. The fact that we have a program that also ensures community cohesion and looks at what the host communities, so that there is interaction between the refugee and the host community is extremely important. So there are quite a lot of the fact that you have recognized some of the civil status issues, the documentation issues that affect refugees is extremely important. So if you like, there are, as I said, there is this little brief booklet that we have on the Global Compact and some of the good practices. But there is a lot where we have seen that the GCR has had a very positive impact on. If you did not have it, I think the situation would really be probably much, much more difficult and more complex. So it has produced its results. Of course, as you say, it will never be enough. We always want more. Of course, we all want more. But it is, let's also not, the perfect can sometimes be the enemy of the good. And we need to build on it and celebrate the achievements and build on it and move ahead, including in the whole context of finding solutions to this particular situation.
Well, I thank you very much for this, for your visit to Lebanon, and wish you all the best in your new position at the UN. And I'm sure that, like Gustavo Guterres, you will take with you this commitment to the noble cause of protecting refugees and supporting them. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Yeah, it will be.
When are you moving?
In July. But you know, he was my former boss. So